This is Jane Muncy, and I'm going to tell the King's Well, which was told to me by my grandmother. Once upon a time, there was three boys that lived with their mom and dad way out in the woods, and their name was Jack and Bill and Mary Wise. Mary Wise was the youngest, and they always thought him the most foolish and fancy-free one of the bunch. So Jack and Bill started out one day to seek their fortune, and of course, Mary Wise, like he always did, put up such a fuss that he wanted to go with them, so they took him along. And they says, Mary Wise, you'll have to mind us now and not go off on any foolish jaunts, and you'll have to stay right with us and act your age. And so he said, well, I will. He promised them. So they fixed their lunch and started out on their long walk to seek their fortune. And as they were going along, they'd been walking about 3 or 4 hours, and they sat down to eat some sandwiches out of their little bags. And Mary Wise says, hush, hush, I hear something. And they all listened, and they heard this chopping sound. It went chop, chop, and it was way off up in the woods, up a mountain. And so he says, I believe I'll go up and see what that is. And they said, oh, no, Mary Wise, we've got to hurry. We haven't got time to fool around with you. And he said, well, I want to know what that is. I have to go see what it is. So he went and he followed the noise, and he got way, way up there. And he saw this axe, and it was just chopping right by itself, chop, chop, chopping all the trees down. So he got the axe and took the axe part off from the handle and put it in his hip pocket and went back down the hill. And his brother says, well, what was it, Mary Wise? He said, oh, nothing at all. So they said, see, we told you. So we got to hurry, and we've wasted time fooling around with you and your fantastic ideas. So they walked on a little farther, and they heard this, they sat down to rest, and they heard this stream, and it sounded like a waterfall, just running and running and running and running. And they walked on up, and there was this beautiful pool, and they got them a drink because they were thirsty. And so Mary Wise says, well, I wonder where all this water comes from. And they said, oh, never mind. What do you care where it comes from? They said, come on, let's hurry. He said, no, I want to go see where it comes from. So they said, well, go on, but we're not going to wait long on you. So he took off up in the hills, and when he got up there, he followed the water until he saw this little tiny walnut. And there was a hole in the walnut, and out of the walnut was coming all this gushing stream of pure water. So he took some moss off of the root of a tree and stopped it up in the walnut and stuck the walnut in his shirt pocket and went on back to his brother's. And his brother said, well, where'd it come from? And he said, oh, it came out of a rock up there. So they said, now, see, we told you. And they said, now, Mary Wise, we're not going to wait for you any more. You'll just have to come on, and because we're not going to stop. So he said, well, I won't stop anymore. So they went on through the woods, and they journeyed and journeyed in days. And finally they came to what was getting into the king's territory. And they saw this great big sign, and it said, any man who can furnish water for the king's well, and dig water and find water that will run into the king's well, will be given the hand of the princess in marriage. And any man that tries and does not succeed will be laid down the chopping block, and his ears will be cut off. So Mary Wise and Jack and Bill went on, and they came and they saw the sign again saying the same thing. Well, they discussed it a little while, and finally Bill says, well, I'm a strong lad. Everybody always said I was the strongest one of the bunch. I think I could probably dig the longest and maybe find water for the king. So Jack says, well, I'm strong too, but says, what I have more is perseverance. Says, I have more ability to stay at a job longer, so I think that I'd make the better one to find out and dig the well for the king and get the hand of the princess in marriage. Mary Wise says, well, I think I'll try too. And they said, well, Mary Wise, you can't do anything. You never could do anything. And he said, well, I think I'll try. And they said, well, you'll just get your ears cut off. And so he says, well, that's all right. So Mary Wise said, they got to the king's place, and Mary Wise said, well, I'm going up and talk to the king and see if he won't let me. So Bill said, "Oh, no, you don't." Said, "I'm the oldest and I'm going first." So he went, talked to the king, and he said, "King, I want to enter this little contest and try to win your daughter's hand in marriage." And so the king said, "All right, but remember, you'll get your ears cut off if you don't do it." He said, "Our whole land is starving for water, and somebody just has to find water pretty soon." So Bill dug and dug and dug, and he used all his muscles, and he dug as hard as he could, and he never could find the water. Well, so they laid him down the chopping block and chopped his ears off. And next came Jack. He says, "Well, now, I have a lot of perseverance, King," and says, "I think I can do this job, and I'd like to try to dig your well for you." So the king says, "All right," said, "remember, if you don't," said, "you get your ears chopped off." So Jack dug and dug and dug, and he'd get tired, but he'd keep digging and digging and digging, and he'd get tired, but he'd dig on and dig on and dig on, and he dug, and he never did find water, just pure old dirt. And so finally he says, "Well, I just give up. I've dug as long as I can." So they laid him down on the chopping block and chopped his ears off. And Mary Wife says, "Well, I might as well have my ears chopped off as the rest of them." So he said, "King," says, "I want to try to dig your well." So the king said, "Well, all right, Mary Wise," said, "you go ahead. But says, remember, you'll get your ears cut off." So Mary Wise dug and dug, and he didn't dig down very far till he was out of sight, until he reached back up in his shirt pocket and took out the walnut out of his pocket and took out the moss and laid it down, and then he told them to throw down a rope, and they threw down a rope, and he came up, and pretty soon the whole well was just filling with this beautiful, pure water that'd come out of the walnut. And the king says, "Well, how in the world did you do it, Mary Wise?" And he said, "Well, I just dug in the right place." So the king was like many other fathers. He didn't want to give his daughter away unless he could help it. And he said, "Now, Mary Wise," he said, "you're a country boy, and says you've come back from the woods, and says, you'd rather have half my kingdom than have my daughter's hand in marriage." And Mary Wise says, "Well," said, "yes, I guess I would. I guess I would just soon have the money." So he took the money, and he went back home, and he built his parents a fine house. And pretty soon he got tired of all this, and he'd grown up a lot. And he says, "Well, I believe I'll go back and see what my brothers are doing back there in town with their ears cut off." So he started back with all his money, and he still had the hatchet. He kept it in two parts in his back pockets. And he came to the same place where the other sign was before, and the sign said, "Anyone who can rid the forest of the giant that's bothering the king can have the king's daughter's hand in marriage." Well, he thought about it a little while, but he didn't think much about it. So he went on to the other sign, and it said the same thing. So he says, "Well, I believe I'll look into this." And he went up to the king, and he says, "King," says, "what is this contest about that you've got on now about getting rid of the giant?" He said, "Well," he says, "this giant," says, "he's come into all my forest, and he's cut down all my trees, and all my lumber has gone, and says he's ruining all the natural resources, and he's taking away all my lumber and just cutting it up, and said, I've got to have somebody to get rid of him, or I'm not going to have anything left in my country." And so the man says, Mary Wise says, "Well," said, "I think I'll enter this contest." And he says, "Well, you remember," says, "if you don't, you get your head chopped off." And he said, "Well, that's all right," says, "I'll risk getting my head chopped off." So he went into the woods, and he heard this great thrashing sound, and he came up where the giant was cutting down the trees and stacking them on his shoulder and getting ready to march home. And he says, "Hey, Mr. Giant." And the giant looked down at him, and the giant says, "Well, what do you want?" And he said, "Well," he says, "I've heard you're taking all the king's lumber." Says, "How many trees do you cut down a day?" The giant says, "Oh, a few hundred." Says, "Why?" He said, "Well, I can cut down more trees than that." The giant says, "Ho, ho, ho," says, "you little old thing." Said, "I know you can't." He says, "Yes, I can." And so the giant says, "Well, let's have a contest." And says, We'll try it out." And says, "I'll try to beat you, and you try to beat me." And says, "I'll start over here, and you start over there." So Mary Wise says, "All right." So he went over on the other side of the wood from the giant, and he put his hatchet together, and he turned it loose, and it started chopping down trees right and left, and right and left, and right and left, and the giant was still chopping on one tree. So pretty soon the giant got tired and says, oh, I think I'll go over and see how that little midget's doing with his chopping. So he went over, and there laid half the forest almost of that forest they were cut down. And Mary Wise was wiping the sweat off of him, and the giant says, well, says, how did you do it? Says, you've already won. I've just got 10 trees chopped down. And so Mary Wise says, oh, it's easy. Said, I'm just strong. I just know how. So the giant says, well, you're a good feller. Says, come on, I'll take you home with me. And says, we'll eat supper. And so Mary Wise says, well, that's a good idea. And all this time the giant was thinking to himself, now I can't have this little creature running down chopping 100 trees to my one, so he could get in on my business. So I'm going to have to take him home with me and do away with him the best I can. So he says, come on home with me. So he said, Mary Wise says, let me help you carry this load of trees you're carrying. They had a big steel thing, a big steel band around all the trees, and had them in one big bundle. And so the giant says, well, okay. So the giant got on one end, and Mary Wise got up on the back end and sat down. And the giant drug the trees through the forest till he came to his great big castle. And Mary Wise was still sitting on the back, and he said, boy, that sure was a hard thing to lift, wasn't it? The giant says, boy, it sure was. Says, I'm so tired. So they put the trees down and went in the house, and Mary Wise said, I sure could stand something to eat, couldn't you? And the giant says, yeah. Says, I think I'll fix about 100 chickens, and says, I think I'll fix me a great big tub full of cottage cheese, and says, maybe a big tub full of milk, and says, I'll have my supper. And Mary Wise says, well, that sounds mighty puny supper to me. Said, I could eat more than that. And so Mary Wise was sitting beside the window, and the giant was sitting over on the other side of the table, and the giant would put things down in front of him. He thought, now, I'll let him eat so much that he'll have such a full stomach that he'll go right off to sleep, and nothing will wake him up during the night. But Mary Wise ate all that he could hold, and then he started just pitching it over his shoulder out the window. And the giant says, boys, you sure can eat a lot for such a little man. And he says, yeah. I said, I know it. Said, boy, I sure am sleepy. So he said, well, here's your bed in here. And so the giant says, and I'll sleep in this other room in here. So Mary Wise said, now, I'm afraid of that giant, so I think I'll just get under the bed and wrap up some covers and put a great big pillow in my bed. So we put a pillow in his bed, and he got under the bed. And the giant came in the night with a great big club and some big nails sticking out of it, and beat on the pillow. And Mary Wise was laying under the bed just laughing away. So the giant says, that fixed him, and he walked out and went in his room and went to sleep. Well, next morning, Mary Wise come out stretching. He says, Giant, old feller, says, you sure do have a lot of flies in your house. Said, last night they lit on me, and said, they just like to worry me to death. I couldn't hardly sleep. And the giant says, well. So he says, Mary Wise, says, you too big a feller for me. Says, I'm going to another part of the world where there's nobody like you. Said, I can't stay around here. This is not big enough for both of us. So the giant packed up his little sack on his back and left. And Mary Wise went back to the king, and he says, King, he says, I've rid the forest of your giant, and says, I've made you well. He says, I have half your kingdom, and I'm not just a poor little country boy now, I'm a rich man. And said, I want your daughter's hand in marriage. So the king says, well, I'm very proud of you, Mary Wise. So the king moved over into the big giant's old castle, and he gave Mary Wise the ruling of his kingdom and his daughter, and Mary Wise became the new king.